Reality Radio Entertainment presents Behind the Curtain with your host, Kathy Barrett.
Welcome to Behind the Curtain. I'm your host, Kathy Barrett. Thanks for tuning in. My special guest today is Timothy Wise. He's an author, an anti-racist, and an educator who has traveled throughout North America for the last 30 years, educating people on the importance of white America coming to terms with the truth about its history of racial violence and inequity. He began as a college activist fighting for divestment from and economic sanctions against apartheid South Africa. Continued working for social justice when he graduated as Associate Director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racists and Nazism to defeat the political candidacies of white supremacists, and I remember this so clearly, and former KKK leader David Duke. Timothy was an adjunct professor for the Smith College School of Social Work in Massachusetts and an advisor to the Fish University Race Relations Institute in Nashville. He has authored several books, all of which are critically acclaimed and must reads. Timothy has been featured in several documentaries, made dozens of television appearances on shows like MSNBC, 2020, NPR, CBS, Nightline, and his videos on social media platforms have received over 20 million views. Be sure to check out his podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. You can also go to the show's website, gobehindthecurtain.com, which will have links to all of Tim's information, as well as the show will be posted there. Tim, so excited to have you on the program. And again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So your body of work as an activist and a writer and educator truly is inspiring. But on a personal note, I want to start off where kind of your fabulous book ends, which is sharing personal stories, right? To understand how we become who we are. And so being a Jewish kid growing up in the South, you had to have faced anti-Semitism. Yes, you did. I'm sure you did.
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, I did, and it was a 1970s, early 80s kind of anti-Semitism contrasted with either what would have been 20 years before that, which would have been a lot more vicious, or perhaps today, which would have been a lot more vicious given the uptick in the last several years. It was grating. It was from maybe fifth grade all the way through about high school. Really, there would always be the teachers who this maybe 7%, not even that, 7 or 8 kids in our school were Jewish. Every other Jewish kid that I knew, every Jewish kid I went to Hebrew school with went to a private school, and other than like 7 of us. And the teachers in the public schools, you always have 1 or 2, who would feel it was their obligation to inform you of your pending eternity in a lake of fire, and they would just pop their head in the class sometimes and just remind you, like, oh, in case you forgot that you're going to hell, I thought I'd remind you this semester too. And so there was that. There were also the kids who would sort of parrot what they heard at home, and the kids were more just operating on ignorance, and sort of not really understanding Judaism. We weren't in the 70s and early 80s in places like Nashville, a very ecumenical community in terms of, sort of interfaith collaboration. So I think for a lot of Christian kids, they didn't understand Judaism. They didn't understand Islam. They didn't understand. We had a pretty decent sized number of Muslim students for that time and place who had come from various places in what we call the Middle East. And I'm sure they experienced a lot of the same kind of othering. It wasn't violent. It wasn't like attacks, but it was just this steady drumbeat of othering, which did create in me. There was this period in 5th grade. I remember I was Reformed. And so I never felt particularly connected to the religious end of Judaism. I was always pretty secular, but of course, a lot of Reform Jews are secular, so it's not that odd. But I just remember
Mm-hmm.
going through this phase in the midst of this sort of intense feeling of anti-Semitism and just this acknowledgement, the recognition of the institutionalization of Christian hegemony in the schools, that I just became like super Jewy for like 4 months, where I was just like wearing a Star of David every day. Like I never did that, but I was just like, I
Right.
want a Star of David. I'm going to wear a, and it was ridiculous. I was like this little bitty kid. I'm 10 or 11 years old. I got this big gold star. It's just absurd. And I did it for like 4 months, more of a I'm Jewish thing,
Yes.
but I joke about it now. Having said that, at the time, look, there were experiences, having a principal in junior high school, what we now would call middle school, that sort of herded all the kids into the auditorium to hear a Young Life presentation, Christian youth group, where the kid standing up talking about his personal relationship with Jesus. And I walked out, I looked around, I found the other Jewish kids. I'm like, what are we going to do? And they didn't do anything. So I stood up and I left, and the principal came out in the hall and said, where do you think you're going? And I did like the Jewiest thing I could think to do, which was I said I was going to call my lawyer. And he said, you don't have a lawyer, you're 11 or whatever you were. And I'm like, well, I got the ACLU number right here in my pocket, because I did
Good for
actually.
you. Good for
And,
you.
and, so there were, I joke about it now. It wasn't real funny then.
Yeah, of course.
It's only partially funny now, but at the same time that all that was happening, I think what is also worth pointing out is that even when I was catching hell, in one way or another, from a principal here or a teacher there or a kid there or whatever, I was also white. And what that meant was that, for the most part, whatever hell I was catching in those schools was pretty minimal compared to what my Black associates, colleagues, friends, classmates, teammates. I played ball on mostly Black teams. All my Hebrew school friends played basketball and baseball at the JCC, in a JCC league. I played at the Y League with the Black kids mostly. And so I got to see both sides of it. I got to see I got to be targeted occasionally. And I also saw what it was to be on the upside of that. So it was a very interesting way to experience it, because I could both see what it was to be a target, for sure, but even more importantly, I had to deal with what it meant to be advantaged, even in that space where I was targeted, which was a very unique kind of position to be in.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so, and you bring this up in your book. It's so important, for us to do that in white America, in terms of sharing these stories. And just, I'll share just a wee bit with you. I'm a bit older, so I grew up at the height of the civil rights movement. So as a young girl, seven, I think I was 6 or 7 at the time, I would see the sit-ins on the news.
Sure.
I would see there was such violence. And a couple of years later, this continued, but also the state decided they were going to come in and do urban renewal in Coney Island. And that is such a horror to have to experience that on both sides,
Sure.
Whether you're a person of color, Black, brown, or white. And so we were literally forced to move. My family was forced to sell their house back to the government. And so I also witnessed all this white flight kind of going on. And I come from a working class family. And so we were poor. My dad didn't have the money to go out to a better neighborhood and put it, and put a down payment. So we had to stay put when my whole neighborhood was empty. And then people of color started moving into our neighborhood and into these abandoned buildings. And so for a brief time, I experienced kind of reverse racism, but it didn't, it helped me to understand in the tiniest fraction of a way how horrible it was for people of color, because you could not be Black or brown and walk into a white neighborhood and make it out alive.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't happen. So I was aware of all that. My family was also with that national philosophy, if you will, which
Yeah.
was, racist. And so as a person, I was separate from my family. Um,
Yeah.
and so, that's my experience, but it didn't, it propelled me more towards wanting to be an anti-racist,
Right.
mixing. I wasn't permitted to bring home a friend of color, but
Right.
I had friends of color, that my parents didn't know about. So anyway, that's a little bit about my experience. But I was raised in Catholic school at the time, and even as a young girl, I think I was 4 kind of when I was in kindergarten, and I had childhood epilepsy. So you do not want to have childhood epilepsy,
Yeah.
in the 1960s
Oh
and
yeah.
in a Catholic school because they assumed that I was talking to Satan during these
Yeah. Right. Right.
seizures that I would have, and I was treated accordingly.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I became a recovering Catholic very early on in my life, because and as far as I'm concerned, the instruction was very kind of subliminal, if you will, just like the guy walked into the classroom, that you mentioned and dropped
Yeah.
that, bomb about what was going to happen to Jewish people. Um, I had that kind of experience there with those nuns, and
Oh
I
yeah.
just decided this is not right. But they would, in the teachings, they kind of make Jews the bad guys.
Yeah.
Jews killed Christ. I mean, who's going to
Right.
get invited on the A party list
Right.
after
But
that
it's
kind
sort
of?
of weird though. But it's weird though, right? Because if we killed Jesus, which isn't actually the history, that's
Right.
not really accurate. But if we did, and if Jesus being crucified and rising again is the only way that the rest of you get to heaven, you should be thanking us, right? I mean, theoretically, like I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant. I'm just saying,
No,
like,
I
really, like
understand.
if we don't do that, you're lost. Like, you should
Right.
be that, like, thank you, Jews, for that. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, again, kidding, but it is weird. Anti-Semitism's weird. All these things are weird because
Yes.
all of them require a certain suspension of disbelief, right? In the
Yes.
common humanity of the people around you to be able to sustain whether it's the stereotypes or the fears or whatever. Because when you think about the stereotypes that we sustain, um, even a lot of times people have stereotypes about folks because they haven't really experienced that group, they haven't really been around that group, so they pick up the stuff from media, they pick up stuff from their parents that they hear,
Yes.
but don't really know. Other times people still have stereotypes even though they've been around folks, and it's because we tend to amplify the experiences with someone who's different, and we remember them differently, right? So that story that you told about finding yourself in a community that was rapidly transitioning and having a lot of Black folks moving in, and maybe they were giving you a hard time or whatever was happening,
Right.
that what's interesting about your approach to dealing with that is it's very different. A lot of people who find themselves in that situation, right, will become very resentful, and they'll remember that mistreatment or the hell that they caught or the things that were said to them, and they'll remember that differently precisely because the people who did that to them were different. Whereas if you had other white kids, maybe in your own Catholic school, being mean to you, or white nuns being mean to you over the epilepsy or whatever, like, you'll
Yeah.
remember it, but psychologically you tend to amplify the way most people amplify the way that racial others, ethnic others, cultural others treat them.
Mhm.
And so, like, I've met plenty of white folks who said, well, the reason they're afraid of Black people is because when they were on the playground in third grade, a Black person jumped them. Well, okay, but then like 3 white people jumped them 2 weeks before that, and another white person beat
Yes.
their ass a year later, and then they had a crummy white boss when they were 27, and a white landlord that wouldn't return the deposit, and so you had all this mistreatment at the hands of people that are like you,
Yeah.
and you don't remember that the way that you remember any mistreatment at the hands of those who were different than you, which is interesting. And that's one of the reasons that biases stay, sort of operative, because the other always takes a spot in our brain that's more prevalent than what we're used to. But the other point about about your story about the neighborhood transitioning. And I had a young woman who came to me after a talk several years ago, with a somewhat similar story to what you were talking about. She was in college. I've been asked to come to her college, and I think it was in upstate New York. And she had, my book White Like Me had been assigned as a reading, and she was very upset about it. And she, keeping in mind now, this book is just a memoir. I'm not trying to tell people in this book what it means for them to be white in America. I'm saying here's what my white experience was. And some of this will resonate with you and some of it won't. And you got to sort of, but my point in the book was, you need to ask, what does it mean to be white in a country that was more or less created for you? And if your experience is different, cool, we can talk about that. Well, she didn't get that part of the book clearly. And so she thought that she was just being attacked and being judged or whatever. And so she came up to me and she said, you know, I grew up in whatever neighborhood, and when I was a kid, it was almost all black. And actually, she said it was an all black neighborhood. And I said, well, it wasn't, because you were there, right? So it wasn't really an all black neighborhood. And she thought that wasn't very funny. And she said, well, you know, mostly black. And they used to call me names, and they would call me this and they would call me that, and I got beat up. And so, you know, what do you have to say about that? And I said to her, what I don't clearly need to say to you, because you've clearly given this some thought that she had not. But I said to her, well, first off, I said, that's terrible. And I'm sorry that happened, because that shouldn't happen to anyone. I'm not going to be the person who, when you say that, says, well, if you think you had it hard, let's talk about black people. No, if you were treated badly, I'm gonna acknowledge that, and I'm gonna tell you how terrible that was, because it was. But I said to her, what you also need to remember is, you're the victim in that situation, not so much of their bigotry. You're actually you are in the moment. That's what you're being victimized. That's why you're experiencing it. But you're actually being doubly victimized. And the second thing that's victimizing you is the same thing that victimized them, which is to say, why is there a neighborhood in New York City that's almost all black? Explain that to me. How is that possible? In one of the most diverse places in the United States, how can you have neighborhoods that are that distinct where you find yourself a fish out of water? The only reason that's possible is because of a history of institutional and systemic racism, not against you and your family, but against them and their families. And if that hadn't happened, there wouldn't have been a quote unquote black neighborhood for you to find yourself in, or a white neighborhood for them to find themselves in. We would have been more mixed from the start. We would have known each other from the start. We wouldn't have had these animosities to begin with. So in a way, you can be mad at them, and that's okay. But you also have to take a broader, more capacious view of what the injury really sourced from, which was this deep-seated institutional injustice, without which there's no reason for that to happen. There's no reason that they would have treated you badly had it not been for this history that kept you apart in the first place, because folks will take advantage of their numbers, right? So that's why white folks will give black and brown folks hell in an almost all white space, because they can. That's why black folks and brown folks will do that to white folks in an almost all black or brown space, because they feel like they can. They have the numbers, right? But they only have the numbers. The numbers are only as skewed as they are because of the history of white supremacy. So you got to also reserve some of that anger, I told her, for the society that set them up, and as a result set you up. You are the collateral damage of white supremacy. They were the direct damage of it. Now you're the collateral damage of it. So, you know, you can stay mad at them, and that's fine. But if you don't get a little angry at the larger system that set you both up, nothing's going to change, you know?
Beautifully said. And, you know, to be honest with you, that's how I felt at the time. I never felt angry. It was like, I understand, because I'm watching the news. I'm watching my elders who I respected, and I'm going, pardon me, but this is bullshit. You know, this is not right. So I got it. And then just to add one final thing, I remember going to school, and I was surrounded, and it was during the winters. So I was pummeled with ice balls, right? And by a group of guys, a group of black guys, young kids, not men. And anyway, I was covering myself, and they were laughing. And I hear this booming voice, and her name was Sadia Pak, and she was a Muslim, and she marched through. She was half the size of these kids, the male kids, and
Mhm.
she broke up what they were doing. She started yelling at them. She took me back to her house in the projects, which I was not
Mhm.
allowed to go to. I had a scrape on my knee. I was shook up. Mom took care of me, gave me hot chocolate, and we became friends. I had also had that experience, which I think kind of set me on the path that I've always been on, which
Sure.
is to defy and be very angry at what's happening in our country,
Sure.
from that day forward. But anyway, I'm glad that we shared this, and hopefully other people will be listening to this, because I find that when you do share a piece of yourself, and as I believe you feel the same way reading it in your book, it makes a difference. It opens up other hearts, and it inspires people to tell their stories. And
Oh,
so
for sure.
hopefully that'll happen. But let's get on to Dispatches from the Race War, which I think I told you in the email. It's a masterpiece to me. I
Thank
mean,
you.
it really lays out the facts about why racism is America's longest war. And you confront white supremacy. You do not pull any punches. You just tell it like it is. And I love that you confronted white supremacy, not only in terms of now, but the history of white
Yeah.
supremacy to present, from the backlash of Obama's presidency to Trump and the rise of white nationalism and Nazism. So, talk about what led you to write this really brilliant book at a particular time when our
Yeah.
country is like totally nuts and with Trump in power.
Well, I had done several books before this, and in addition to White Like Me, which was a memoir, I had done an essay collection back in 2008 with a different publisher called Speaking Treason Fluently, and it was a collection of pre-published stuff that extended from about 1995 to about 2008, or 1998 to about 2008. And I had written hundreds of pieces since then, including a lot of pieces during the Obama years, obviously, and a lot of pieces in the Trump years. And I felt as though, rather than doing a whole, and then I had done a couple of other books that were data driven and footnote driven and sort of academic-y kind of thing. But I felt like with all these essays out there floating around in different places, on different websites, different publications, my own website, I felt like I needed to compile them, because there had been such an arc of history in just a very short period of time, from 2008 to 2020, that 12 to 13-year period on the calendar of the Obama two administrations and Trump. And there had been and when I say there had been an arc, we start in 2008 with a phenomena that I wrote about in another of my books called Between Barack and a Hard Place, this sort of mentality of sort of post-racial America, and that idea that we had reached this post-raciality because of the election of a black man as president. And of course, I pushed back on that in that book, Between Barack and a Hard Place, and I'd written a lot of pieces about it. But the fact that we start the period there, and then by 2020, I think everybody, including the people who said we were post-racial in 2008, we're all sort of recognizing, like, maybe jump the gun a little on that one, because of
Yes.
what happened in the last 4 years. And so it was such a clarifying arc of the last 12 years that I wanted to have it all in one place. And so I start off talking about race the way we were talking about it in the Obama years, which was in some ways my job, it seemed, in those essays when I wrote them, and then when I compiled them in this book, was to convince white people that racism was still a thing. I mean, that was sort of the job for the 8 years of Obama. For the 4 years of Trump, that still was the job for some people, but the kind of people that after Trump still are doubting that racism is a thing, or like, they're unreachable. I can't
Yes.
spend my time trying to get those people to acknowledge the reality in front of their face. But a lot of the white liberal folks, frankly, who even they in the Obama years were like, oh, well, that's sort of handled, right? So we can move on to some other issue. And like, they're liberal and they vote for Democrats and they like Obama and they agree with progressives on pretty much all policies, but they just didn't really want to talk about race. Even they now that last 4 years, we're starting to come to a realization. So as the book turns from the Obama years to the Trump years, the tone of the book obviously changes. Now we're dealing with an administration that is really encouraging some of the most pernicious elements of the far right and white nationalism, a kind of racism that we hadn't really been dealing with directly for the most part for that 12 years. You know, the 12 years of Obama, my job was to sort of deal with the institutional and the structural and the subtle, you know, the subtle types of ways that racism operates. Subtle for white people, not so subtle for black and brown folks, perhaps. But with Trump, you know, we sort of moved from the dog whistle politics of the previous 40 to 50 years, where politicians felt they needed to sort of cover up a little bit of how racist they were being. They had to use coded language. They had to, you know, speak in terms that were somewhat sublimated. And with Trump, he just doesn't do that. He doesn't code anything, right? So it became this air siren. And so it was a very different kind of thing. And to sort of look at how far back the country had come at a time when it was really wanting to pat itself on the back was the purpose of the book. The title of the book, I'd always wanted to title a book this, mostly because I tell a story at the very beginning in the introduction that sort of sets it up that, you know, back in 1994, I was at a family reunion, and this was the non-Jewish side of my family, my mom's dad's people. And we're in Memphis for a reunion. And so it's 94. So I'm 26. So it's half my life ago at the time that I'm writing the book. But I've already been doing anti-racism work at that point for 4 years. I'd already done the anti-David Duke work. I was already a community organizer. And we're sitting there at the reunion, and a great aunt of mine who I always adored, and very liberal, definitely a Democrat, very, but, carrying around a lot of fear of black people. Her neighborhood in Birmingham was starting to change, and it was almost all black now. And she felt afraid and all this other stuff. And I remember her at the reunion I was telling her what I'd been doing since I graduated, and she looked over at me and leaned in real close, and she goes, "Tim," because she had this very heavy Southern accent. "Tim," turns it into a 2-syllable first name, which is hard to do. "Tim, do you think we're ever gonna have a race war?" Turns war into a 2-syllable word as well. And I just looked at her sort of funny, and I sort of chuckled, and I thought, And what I said to her was some version of, I explain it better once I had time to think about it, but it was some version of, well, I think we're sort of already in one, Aunt Jean. I don't think, like, the implication of her comment was, do you think black folks are going to start shooting us dead in the street? That's what she means.
Right.
And what I'm saying is, well, I don't know. But what I do know is that the war started hundreds of years ago. We started it. Here's how we started it. And now what seems to have you afraid is that maybe the folks we've been firing at all this time are starting to fight back, or have been fighting back, let's say, for a long time. And now you're aware of their fighting back. They've always been fighting, but you didn't have to know about that until now. And it scares you because you feel the war may be slipping away a little bit. And she, I didn't say it quite that obnoxiously. Perhaps, I'm sure I said it very kind, but then she just got up to go play bridge with the other old folks or whatever you do, but it was that exchange. It was that realization that for white folks, this isn't an issue until black people make it an issue, right? And for black folks, it's an issue from the day that they're born, and they become aware of it, whether they like it or not. For white folks, it's like they're not thinking about it until all of a sudden the neighborhood changed, or until all of a sudden something happens at school, or until all of a sudden they don't get a job, and the person who got the job happens to be, black or brown. And so the assumption is, oh, well, they took my job from me. When in fact, like, if you didn't have the job yet, it wasn't your job to take, bub. I don't know what to tell you, but so there's that, like, it's just this obliviousness. And so to me, that's the worst part of the race war, is that you got one group of people that have been winning the war for hundreds of years, that started it, initiated it, got it going, have been winning it for hundreds of years, are suddenly upset that, like, oh, you mean the other side doesn't just roll over and go away? Like,
Right.
they don't just die? Like, what's that about? Well, that's sort of how wars work, So that was the point behind the book, was to sort of explore what it is white folks don't get, either in the Obama years or the Trump years, and sort of show the line that goes straight from one of those to the other.
As you were writing it, and even I think when it came out, we didn't know who was going to be elected in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I was unsure. It came out that December, but it had gone to press before the outcome.
Okay.
And I think by that point I was feeling pretty good about the notion that he wasn't going to win.
Uh-huh.
But I also was holding my breath. I told my publisher, I'm like, maybe we should have 2 intros or 2 epilogues or something in here. And they're like, no, it's not going to matter. It's fine, whatever. And in some ways that's true, because part of what the book is trying to say is that no matter who's the president, like, yes, it definitely feels different the last 4 years versus the 8 before that. But no matter who's the president, the issues are the same. And it's only a question of which of these is going to, or whoever you're going to have, how's it going to feel? But the issue, the underlying issue of systemic inequality and injustice is going to be the same. And so the work of anti-racist people doesn't really change substantively, or shouldn't, no matter who the president is. If Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, yeah, we wouldn't have had a president who said nice things about those guys in Charlottesville. Yes, we wouldn't have had a president that called Caribbean nations and African nations and Central American nations, quote unquote, shithole countries or whatever. Like, that wouldn't have happened. But like, the wealth disparities between white and black folks would have been the same. The unemployment differences, the poverty rate differences, the health outcome differences. Yeah, none of that would have really changed. Right. So what I think is important, and what I still think we haven't learned, is, in that 8 years of Obama, I think some folks sort of eased up a little bit, because they felt like, okay, there's sort of the inevitability of progress mentality. Like, things are getting better. Yeah, he's catching a lot of hell from people in Congress, but the fact that he won twice obviously says we've turned a corner, and the browning of America means the right wing is done, and young people are going to always make the difference, and that means the right wing is done. Like, we count our chickens way too soon in this country. And so you would think Trump would mean that we know better, but then what happened, and I've seen it since 2020, since the election, since this book came out, I think there are a lot of folks who also started breathing more easily again, like, oh, thank God, Trump. And then, of course, the insurrection happened. But now that the January 6th committee is looking like they might make criminal referrals, you've got some of these folks that have been sent to jail. It might end up coming back to haunt Trump himself. Like, I think there are people that are thinking, like, can we just put this behind us? And clearly the Democrats won the midterms, so things are getting better. Like, don't assume anything, right? Is the important thing to remember is we have 400 years of evidence that white supremacy doesn't go away. 400 years of evidence that it doesn't go away. It just morphs and shape shifts and changes form. So you can assume that history is still happening, and that it's going to just find a new way to manifest, even without Trump there to conjure it up in a blatant way. Or you can assume that this is the moment when history suddenly ends. And I think, we know from the late 80s and early 90s, when Francis Fukuyama wrote that book, The End of History, and now he sort of had to walk it back and be like, that's not really what I meant. Yeah, clearly, right? Because history didn't end, and the neoliberal model of the West is not, everything that it's cracked up to be, and it hasn't conquered the world, and there is still conflict, and including some of the old conflicts that we thought were buried. So the same is true here. I think it's much safer for us if we start the assumption that white supremacy has been the constant in American history going back to the colonial era. And it's always just a question of how we are responding to it and the way that it's manifesting. But the idea that Joe Biden is going to make it go away, the idea that young voters are going to make it go away, the idea that the browning of America is going to make it go away. White supremacy is not that weak. It is a lot more powerful than that. And that was something that I wanted to convey in the book too, that it's this, it looks different. It feels different. And I'm certainly not saying it doesn't matter who the president is. It absolutely matters, but it will matter a lot less if you're unaware of how it can continue, because if you're not aware of how it can continue, no matter who the president is, you'll take the foot off the gas, take the foot off the brake that you're pushing down to try to stop it, and then it reasserts itself, and that's what concerns me.